Ladies and gentlemen, good day and welcome to webinar on dealing with US sanctions and Indian perspective. As a reminder, all participant lines will be in the listen-only mode. There will be an opportunity for you to ask questions after the presentation concludes. Should you need assistance during the conference call, please signal for an operator by pressing star then 0 on your touchtone phone. Please note that this conference is being recorded. I now hand the conference over to Mr. Nishith Desai, founder of Nishith Desai Associates. Thank you and over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody in Mumbai, and it's really raining very heavily here and very windy. I think one of those days that we see ample amount of rain and all the chaos. But I think given the fact that we are having this webinar, I hope we are all in safe and comfortable place. And some of you might have been waiting in the offices or otherwise, but just we want to make sure that you are able to reach home safely. Also, good morning, good evening to other people in the other parts of the world who have joined from different countries. We have an overwhelming response here, and we are delighted that we are all here to understand the sanctions, and particularly the U.S. sanctions and what could be Indian perspective. As you know, sanctions have been now very much talked about, especially in India, because India has traditionally significant amount of business with Iran and Russia, and all those businesses have come under some kind of a cloud. It is very important to comply with the sanctions and at the same time make sure that your business is not disrupted. So we thought that it will be very useful. We get lots of queries and lots of clients ask a number of different questions, and we thought it might be useful for people to understand the basic concept of the sanctions. There are unilateral sanctions and there are multilateral, and we have to understand what is the impact on Indian businesses and how to wade your way through if you are by any chance got unaware or do something that is not intended, but how to deal with that. It's very, very important to understand this sanctions business physically. And what are the countermeasures also some of the countries are taking in relation to this whole sanctions that are being imposed, particularly by the U.S. And for that purpose, we have assembled a very good team here from India and from the U.S. To start with, I have Nishith Desai. He is leading India practice for Paul Hastings out of Washington in particular, and he has significant experience in this area, and it would be useful to hear his perspective. So, Ronak, can I ask you to explain the basic concept of the sanctions and what it's all about? If you can just give some kind of introductory stuff, and you can also introduce yourself a little more in detail, because all that you're doing in this area. So it will be useful for the audience to, understand where you're coming from.
Absolutely, and Nishith, thank you so much for having me. This is such an important topic, and Nishith Desai and the entire firm has been consistently such a thought leader on these very pressing and critical regulatory issues that are affecting cross-border work and that affect the work of clients all over the world. And this discussion, I think, is very timely, just given the renewed interest of U.S. sanctions, as well as a renewed resurgence in U.S. sanctions activity all around the world, especially under the new Trump administration, or I should say relatively new Trump administration. I've been working on these issues for clients around the world for several years now, and it's a fast-evolving area of the law, and new issues arise monthly. And I think for that reason, this seminar cannot be more timely. But U.S. sanctions just to provide a very, very brief overview, are a tool that the United States has been using for more than 200 years. Historically, they've included embargoes, asset freezes, and U.S. sanctions typically target either individuals or countries or both. And it's a very basic premise. The U.S. wants to influence the behavior of other countries or their citizens by imposing sanctions respectively on those two things. And we've seen this happen across different U.S. administrations. They are tools that are adopted in conjunction with both the executive branch and the United States Congress. And in the U.S., as a policy feature, there's something that the U.S. has adopted pretty aggressively in a whole host of different capacities and contexts. And we saw sanctions being imposed in countries around the world. Of course, most recently, some of the more prominent examples include American sanctions against Russia, Venezuela, Myanmar, Sudan, and of course, Iran. And those sanctions are targeting not just those countries, but activities within those countries, and specifically different sectors within those countries. So in Iran, for example, U.S. sanctions target the country's banking industry, the insurance industry, shipping, and of course, oil and gas. And that's just a basic overview, but the idea to remember is straightforward. The U.S. wants to influence the behavior of a certain country or individual, and it does so through its sanctions regime.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's always been wonderful working with you, and even as as a firm, we are India-centric global law firm, and it's been continuously, an awesome experience to be interacting with you. So thank you so much for coming once again. But can you just also tell us now? There are some extraterritorial application of this law in the U.S. For the U.S. So can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this is a unique feature of American sanctions, is the so-called extraterritorial or so-called secondary sanctions feature when sanctions are imposed. And the best way to understand secondary or extraterritorial sanctions is to understand primary sanctions. And a good example is Iran, which you mentioned in your introduction. The U.S. has sanctioned Iran for several years, and as I just mentioned, the U.S. targets Iran's oil sector, insurance, shipping, banking, as well as a number of individuals. The primary target of U.S. sanctions, Iran. Yet at the same time, the U.S. also targets third-party countries or individuals that engage in business with the primary target. So what that means is U.S. sanctions, and the U.S. asserts that its sanctions regime extends to any other country or individual that does business with Iran. And this is where India and Indian companies get implicated as well. Whether you're a state-owned Indian company or whether you're a private company in India, if you engage with business in Iran, whether it's through banking, whether it's through insurance, whether, of course, through oil trade, and that's something we'll talk about here in a minute, I'm sure, you're also exposing yourself to U.S. sanctions exposure. And that's the real unique but also tricky and somewhat volatile aspect of U.S. sanctions, that even though one is not the primary target, one can still become targeted just by doing business. And the consequences of conducting business with the targeted country or individual, whether it's Iran or whether it's Russia, whether it's Venezuela, all three countries who have very, very important equities with India, the danger there is so India itself can be wrapped up in that sanctions regime. And the penalties are very strict and severe. It can actually potentially lead to the company or to the state-owned entity being cut off and prohibited from dealing with the U.S. financial system, which of course has tremendous and profound implications.
So, it's very critical, and I think how critical is it from the U.S. Because what kind of things can happen, and how do you help people? How do you assist people in complying with these sanctions?
Right. And, again, the consequences can vary. The most immediate one is that the entity, the Indian company or individual, they can lose access to the U.S. financial system. They can lose access to the U.S. banking system. And to not be able to deal with the U.S. financial system, just given how ubiquitous it is around the world, has some major repercussions. And it would be very difficult for the Indian entity or individual to find a workaround if they're cut off. The area of international regulation and the U.S. sanctions regime, Nishith, it presents major compliance challenges for U.S. and foreign companies operating in the global market. We live in a globalized world. Cross-border work is increasingly prevalent, and it becomes very difficult to navigate this. And what we see often with clients is that, these are multinational global countries who have equities around the world, including with countries that may be the target of sanctions. What we also see very often are companies, whether they're from India or anywhere around the world, major subsidiaries or a subsidiary of a subsidiary, may import a single part from a sanctioned country, they have no idea that it's down the supply chain, and that can trigger sanctions exposure. So one of the things that I do is advise corporate clients on both the scope and the subtleties of U.S. sanctions regulations. And we assist clients with direct export, investment, financial transaction, hiring of foreign nationals, third-party distributor relationships, joint ventures, things like mergers and acquisitions, licensing agreements, parent and subsidiary relationships, on how to navigate all those different types of issues that have sanctions equities in a manner that's consistent with governing U.S. law and governing U.S. sanctions issues. And again, in the U.S. government, this is an area that touches virtually, every branch within the government and touches various departments and administrations. And we will often represent companies abroad in front of those agencies and those branches in all those different capacities to make sure that they're, one, compliant, and if they're not, to ensure that they become compliant. And if they are forcing enforcement action, let's say the United States Treasury, to represent those companies in a way that will provide enforcement relief to them ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm curious to know a bit about CATSA, the recent measures that have been levied by the U.S. So can you tell something about CATSA?
Right, so CATSA has become, in the U.S. sanctions landscape, one of the most recent.
What does the full form of CATSA?
Yeah, and CATSA stands for Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act. And the United States Congress always is very innovative of coming up with these names and these very complex acronyms. Yes. And the law was passed in July of 2017 with overwhelming bipartisan support in the United States Senate, our upper house. It was a 98-2 vote in favor. And CATSA targets specifically Iran, North Korea, and Russia. And what the United States did, especially the Senate, is they identified various adverse activity that they claimed these countries were engaging in, and as a result imposed pretty serious sanctions on those three countries as a result. And this was something that was done, again, July of 2017, which, of course, was right before the Obama administration left office. What's happened as a result is, even again, the law targets these three countries as primary targets. Countries around the world, of course, have now been subject to America's so-called secondary extraterritorial sanctions. And India has now found itself very much in the crosshairs of that law, which was passed a couple of years ago. And the reason for that, of course, is that India and Indian companies and Indian individuals, they have major cross-border equities, especially with India and Iran. And with Iran, it's in the energy sector. India and Iran have a long-standing energy relationship. Iran is one of India's biggest energy suppliers. And as a result, because of this oil trade that has existed between India and Iran for decades, Indian companies now find themselves potentially exposed to U.S. sanctions should they continue doing oil trade with Iran. On Russia, there's a defense relationship that dates back, of course, to the Cold War. And India has a so-called legacy defense relationship with Russia. And for that reason, it's now finding itself potentially a target of U.S. sanctions. The most immediate issue that's emerged is India's purchase of the S-400 missile defense system. And that's a surface-to-air missile defense system that the Indian government had planned to buy for a very long time. And what has happened now is the U.S. has said that, look, India, if you potentially buy this system as you've planned, it could potentially expose you to sanctions. Now, the U.S. and India enjoy a very strong relationship. There's a bipartisan consensus behind that relationship, so we're hoping that there can be a government-to-government agreement that'll avoid India getting caught into this. But again, it's a real problem. And, Turkey, which is planning on buying the same system, they're very close to being sanctioned by the U.S. government for buying the exact same system. So this is a good example of how recent developments in the sanctions enforcement landscape have once again led to the extension of secondary sanctions, and Indian companies, Indian clients, Indian multinationals have to now worry about this in a very real way.
Yeah, thank you. Ronak, you remember the U.S. walking out of the multilateral? Are you still speaking, or you want me to go to the next?
No, please.
Oh,
please.
Sorry. Thank you. So, you remember the U.S. walking out of the multilateral nuclear deal that was achieved with Iran in 2015. Now, what are the implications of this walkout? And what happened?
Yeah, and that's a very important question, Nishith, and that's something that I think, again, affects, so many of our Indian counterparts and clients. And if you recall, that deal was entered into by not just the U.S. and Iran, but by a host of other countries. And the United States put pressure on a number of countries to get Iran to the table to sign the deal. And under the Obama administration, the United States told India and a host of other countries, including China, Japan, South Korea, that we're trying to get Iran to sign this deal. And it won't sign this deal unless you reduce oil imports from Iran into your country. And India complied, and India began cutting its imports of Iranian oil. Ironically, when the current President Trump exited the deal last May, India and other similarly situated countries now find themselves in the exact same position they were just a few years ago, where they're now being told, you must, again, reduce your cooperation, reduce your engagement with Iran, or face secondary sanctions. And the short answer to your question is this: with the exit of the United States from the Iran deal, the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCOPA, we're going to see Iran and India's oil trade plummet. India is Iran's second biggest purchaser of oil after China, and yet that's the biggest area of potential sanctions exposure. Many oil refineries, Nishith, in India are built exclusively to process Iranian oil. And that's something that has been communicated to the U.S. government. Yet the U.S. government is saying, no, you must reduce oil imports or face potential secondary sanctions. And what we've seen in a relatively short time since the United States exited the deal is that, yes, in fact, India has begun to dramatically reduce its reliance on Iranian oil. So imports are starting to be cut in a very significant way. The Indian oil sector has been forced to find alternative supplies, whether it's through the United States, whether it's through other countries in the Middle East and the Gulf in particular. And what that means is higher import bills. But the most immediate consequence of the U.S. withdrawal for India is going to be on the oil and gas sector, some of the country's most prominent, companies that you and I both know, and it's going to force them, which it already has, to reduce oil imports, find alternative sources, and again, find insurance companies willing to continue extending insurance to the imports that are still continuing right now. And that's going to be the most immediate impact, and I think this is going to continue. The U.S. in the past has provided so-called waivers to countries to immunize them from American sanctions under the condition that they have shown the right efforts to reduce their reliance on Iranian oil. Now, under President Obama, Indian companies were receiving the sanctions every 6 months, so long as they could demonstrate that the reductions in Iranian oil imports were significant. Under President Trump, waivers have been issued at least once, but there have been conflicting signals as to whether those waivers have continued. And one of the things that we do when we counsel these companies, again, is to provide guidance as to whether or not, one, the waivers will be forthcoming, and two, under what circumstances these companies and the countries can really secure those waivers.
So, how should Indian companies, for example, ensure that they don't fall out of the sanctions? What are kind of how do they coordinate the legalities between the two countries? And can you just give a little idea about because managing this whole syndrome that involves application of the U.S. law and also Indian law and international law. In the middle of that, how should they be gearing themselves?
Right, and I think there's two components to that. I think the first one here is any company, state-owned, private, a hybrid, whatever it may be, must have an appropriate and adequate knowledge of their own operations and to understand, just as a first level question, whether any of the work in which they engage has equities with any sanctioned country. And in my experience, companies themselves are surprised to find out again that some remote part that they import for part of their operations for manufacturing 4 iterations away is coming from a sanctioned country. Or they find out that one of the low-level individuals of their team has potentially contravened sanctions or has run afoul of sanctions. So these companies themselves need to know what their operations entail. And if given the complexity and Byzantine nature of, again, transnational and cross-border work, that's where law firms come in. And U.S. law firms as well as Indian law firms are very well positioned to conduct these assessments, one, to understand, is there any sanctions exposure? And then two, if there is, to address the right way to mitigate it and to ensure that the individual or entity is under compliance or can be defended against if there's an enforcement action. And the critical aspect here, Nishith, is that Indian law firms and U.S. law firms have to coordinate together. It's not enough to engage just one. There needs to be a collaboration between both the Indian and the U.S. side to cover their respective jurisdictions, but to also coordinate in a way that's offering the client a comprehensive plan to ensure that their protection is prophylactic and comprehensive. And I think that's the part in a lot of cases that I see missing when companies approach me for advice or counsel. And, in my experience, what's worked out best when we've been able to deliver the best results for clients has been when, again, the work has been prophylactic and it's been in conjunction with our counterparts in India or in any country in which the company is operating. And finding the right firm there is important. I mean, this is an increasingly specialized area of practice. The sanctions regime from the U.S. has evolved in a whole host of different ways. I just think about how much has changed in the last 5 years. So finding the firm with the right institutional competence becomes absolutely central. And that's something I think that tends to be missing when we are addressing sanctions issues where, again, one isn't enough. There needs to be two, and there needs to really be a full, thorough risk assessment done on both sides of the equities involved.
So I think having got some good insight from you on the U.S. side, let me turn to my colleagues, Nishith Desai and Siddharth Rathore. Vyapak, as you all know, many of you know him, he is one of the most leading international dispute resolution practitioner, and he leads our international litigation, dispute resolution practice, and investigation practice. And he is also co-chair of Mumbai Center for International Arbitration and very active around the world. And Siddharth Rathore is a senior member of our International Dispute Resolution and International Litigation Practice Group. And let me turn to them now for certain questions. I think what's the Indian perspective? And First question that I have for Vyapak and Siddharth is that are these sanctions, do these sanctions have force of law in public international law and particularly in the context of India? Could you just give a little background about, Indian law and Indian legislation that was enacted long ago, and what is the relationship with the U.S. and stuff like that? So maybe if you can give a little overview about whether these are enforceable at all, or what is the sanctity of this sanctions vis-a-vis Indian companies. Yeah, over to you.
Sure. So I think the short answer would be a clear no, because people would want to know what is the legal
That's typical
legitimacy.
lawyering, right?
That would be the legal legitimacy around the
Okay.
U.S. sanctions,
Right.
because I think there is a clear distinction that people sometimes miss out as to what are the UN sanctions versus what are the US sanctions. While we have a codified provisions under Indian law related to the UN sanctions, US sanctions obviously are more unilateral, and therefore the compliance is also, in a sense, voluntarily done or sometimes managed. As Ronak was saying, that there is a great need of understanding the implications and managing your businesses to avoid any altercations or avoid any severe implications. But from an Indian law perspective, there is not much of Indian law, codified Indian law in terms of implementation. But maybe Siddharth, you can elaborate and explain the difference and how India treats the UN sanctions versus US sanctions, and then we can take it forward from there.
Thank you, Vyapak. So, yeah, as Vyapak correctly mentioned, the critical difference between US sanctions, which are unilateral sanctions, and UN sanctions is that in public international law, US sanctions do not have legitimacy. It is more so to do with the US using its economic might to force countries to comply with its sanction measures, or else the countries would have to deal with the commercial consequences of not dealing with the sanctions. So, when it comes to unilateral sanctions, it is not about some multilateral regime or resolution that has been passed and ratified by India. It is more to do with commercial objectives of companies who would have to measure whether there is a way to circumvent these sanctions, or whether they have to comply with these sanctions, because not complying with them would lead to ramifications which would not allow them to be
Dealing with the US.
to deal with the US and sustain their business obligations as well. In
UN.
in terms of under UN sanctions, India itself has legislations under the United Nations uh, Security Councils Act, wherein the government is empowered to pass certain notifications which requires companies to comply with these UN sanctions. For example, as Ronak had mentioned, that when the 2015 Iran deal was achieved between countries, it was ratified by the UN. Accordingly, India started complying with it and started reducing its oil imports from Iran. Now, what has happened is that the US has said that India needs to stop all its imports from Iran, oil imports from Iran. Now, there is no international regime or obligation under law that India would need to abide by. However, it has to take a call on what would hurt it more, whether continuing to import oil from Iran versus facing the ramifications of breaching US sanctions.
Sure. Also, typically, if uh, the provisions of the UN Securities Councils Act in India, which was passed in 1948, would not typically apply, India would deal with some of the measures through their foreign trade policy. So I think along with the act and the provisions, one needs to also uh, rely upon or refer to the foreign trade policy through which India also governs or restricts or manages its trade relationships with the other countries who come under the regime of sanctions. Typically, as we are talking about the U.S. sanctions. So, I think that would be our introductory remark, and the point we are trying to emphasize is that since there is no direct regulatory regime around this, it becomes even more important for evaluation of the trade and business which each country would be doing, which may have linkages to the countries under sanction by US, and also which may have other business relationships with US and other countries. So that's where it stands as of now.
So, what's the direct impact on India from the recent US sanctions, especially in the context of Iran and Russia?
So, as Ronak had mentioned a bit while earlier, India imports 70% of its oil from Iran, and 62% of all of its defense equipment that it imports from all over the world is from Russia. So the recent US sanctions on Iran and Russia heavily impacts India, because for decades India relied on these two countries for two of its most important needs, that is oil and defense equipment. However, at the same time, of late, India has also been looking to strengthen its relations with the US. It has also been called the strategic partner of the US. So, India is, in a way, caught in a catch 22 situation where it cannot also break off its relations with Iran and Russia to an entire extent. At the same time, if it wants to continue increasing its relationship with the US, it will have to think about how it can comply with these sanctions and at the same time continue its relations with Iran and Russia. Having said that, uh, India also exports a lot of equipment to Iran. For example, a lot of heavy machinery, a lot of steel exports to Iran, a lot of two-wheelers and three-wheelers, also a lot of agricultural products like fertilizers and seeds. So now, having with these US sanctions, a lot of these businesses have to rethink their export strategy with respect to Iran. And when it,
So also bringing in Ronak here, and maybe Nishit bhai, I'm interjecting
Mhm.
for a
Sure,
minute.
sure, most welcome.
But Ronak, when it comes to CATSA and some of the provisions which, let's say, defines or it entails saying that what is sanctioned as a secondary sanction is to carry out significant transactions, and possibly there is no definition of significant transactions. So, do you have any view on that, particularly in reference to Russia and India relationships?
Right. So this is something that's looked at carefully both by those of us that practice at the law firm and also in terms of the government. And many of us that have done this work served in the government on the other side, so have some insight into how various U.S. agencies will look at an enforcement activity with respect to Russia. I mean, ultimately, what we try to assess is the level of interaction, how deep is the engagement, what was the intention behind it. I mean, one thing that the Treasury Department, which is in many cases the lead enforcement authority, especially on Russia-related issues, will look at is the intent. Was this, something that happened unknowingly, or was this something that was done knowingly or with the intent of trying to actually invade, even unilateral sanctions? And the distinction between unilateral and multilateral is important. You both hit the nail on the head insofar as, India's official position is that it only abides by UN-imposed sanctions, which are multilateral, as opposed to unilateral sanctions by America. The challenge, of course, is that, the Indians, from our perspective, even though they say that, they still very much make efforts to comply, even with U.S. sanctions. And with respect to Russia specifically, that creates a whole host of problems. Now, one thing that's important to understand is that even if the law says this level of conduct that this company has engaged in could rise to the level of triggering sanctions exposure, an important component of this is the fact that there is, in many cases, a policy or political solution in the short term. And the issue with the S-400 is a perfect example of that, where that's a defense system that the Indian government is purchasing. As a result, it's unclear whether it's possible for the U.S. Congress to legislate a waiver which would prohibit the United States executive branch from sanctioning India for the purchase of that. Private companies, on the other hand, have to be much more careful. And private companies and private individuals are not going to be able to afford themselves that level of protection or hope to rely on a political or policy solution to do so. And again, the companies that, the countries that I see more often in my work leading the India practice in the U.S. is, of course, Russia and Iran, mostly in the oil and gas sectors, but also in terms of, both of you mentioned imports of certain parts in terms of manufacturing, machinery, those things as well. Pharmaceuticals, for example, have a big role to play, and which is why if you are in those industries or sectors, you have to be extra careful to ensure that you are maintaining compliance.
Understood.
And so go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just had a one follow-up question. See, one aspect is very clear as to when you are actually entering into a trade, or a business in that sense, which may be a contract or an agreement or a service-related agreement. Uh, I think that is one level of evaluation, and we understand the implications there and how to go about it. I think the second level of implication and evaluation is the cross holdings between Indian companies having holdings in Iran or Russia in terms of shareholding or control, and vice versa, and then their dealings, right? Which gets a little more complicated because there may not be a direct business dealing where goods or services are shipped to and fro between the countries, but here you are talking about having shareholding or a control on the businesses between the countries. Uh, uh, what is the thresholds there, or what are the do's and don'ts uh, in terms of how to go about in those kind of cases?
Right. And I think, again, the issue there, of course, is what you said is control. And, most companies in this day and age have not just a multinational presence, but the subsidiary structure is quite complex and quite Byzantine, and there's a whole host of compelling reasons behind that. And one of the things that we do is to really look at the ownership structure on the one hand of the company, and then to look at the governance structure. Now, is there a hard and fast rule that the U.S. government has that says if it rises above this level, it's going to trigger? No. I mean, their analysis actually is a lot more, in many ways, sophisticated than that. But one of the factors that the government looks for and that we look for as well is control and ownership. And what we've seen, and all I can give you really is past enforcement actions and past opinions that various enforcement authorities in the U.S. have formulated, is that they say if there is active control, if there should have been knowledge, even if that knowledge was constructive versus actual, that's enough for them to find possible exposure. And again, I mean, I know I sound like a broken record here, but for the company to know its operations well, to know the ownership structure, to know what its holdings are, that's what's going to become very, very important. And ultimately, if there is a command component at play, that's something that U.S. enforcement authorities and U.S. regulators will look at very, very carefully. And I wish I could give you bright lines as to say, expressly do this and expressly don't do that, or if it's a subsidiary of a subsidiary, it's not a. Unfortunately, those types of bright line rules simply don't apply. And I strongly encourage companies, existing clients to ensure and to keep doing ongoing reviews, and for prospective clients to say, go to a law firm, get this type of appraisal done. That way, we know exactly what's underneath the hood of the car to ensure that there aren't any risk factors present when dealing with a Russia or an Iran or even a Venezuela. I mean, Venezuela is another country that, again, India has many, many important equities with, and I know so many Indian companies, whether it's pharmaceuticals or agricultural products or just, again, oil trade, are going to have major issues with.
So, Vyapak, Siddharth, and I think Ronak, simply speaking, what are some of the ramifications if Indian companies, fail to comply with the U.S. sanctions? What would happen? What could be subjected?
Yeah, this is Ronak. I mean, the most immediate is they could lose access to the U.S. financial system. That's one. They could face major financial penalties. I mean, these are criminal penalties that the U.S. government will impose. So the spectrum that we've seen is everything from losing access to the financial system, which would effectively render that respective company's operations, it would significantly impair those operations, if not totally shut them down. Significant financial penalties. We've seen these penalties range from hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars. We've seen assets being frozen, and we've actually seen individuals, depending on the severity of the violation, be put on a targeted list by Treasury or by another corresponding U.S. agency. Now, again, the intent here matters a lot. The scope of the violation matters. The magnitude of the violation matters. And if the company was taking remedial efforts, those things matters. But the scope, the spectrum of penalty, I would say, is anything from, again, losing access to the financial system to a more robust criminal enforcement. And that's what we've seen with companies around the world, especially those, again, that have significant exposure to the countries that we're talking about that are targeted by the U.S. But again, I'll let Vyapak and then let me know if you guys have any other thoughts. But that's what we've seen from the U.S. side.
Yeah, and just to add to
Vyapak,
what
do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think Siddharth.
Yeah, just to add to what Ronak was saying, just to give some real life examples. In the case of what happened to Huawei, right? The US banned, for example, Google from, and many of its US entities from supplying components to Huawei. Huawei cannot even use the Android operating system right now on its phones. So these are some of the other ramifications that companies would have to think about, because there could be a ban on procurement from US entities. There could be a ban on US entities from investing in Indian entities. Um One example could be, like, let's say a company could get banned from using Microsoft Office, or Microsoft could be directed to stop supplying its products to to Indian companies. So there are a lot of such other measures which may seem ancillary but could have consequences which would really affect the core business interests of Indian entities.
Also, there are, people forget sometimes that there may not be direct trade or businesses that one may be, doing on a regular basis or anticipated in near future. But there can be, back end technology or other service agreements, which may already be part of the business in overall manufacturing or, providing other services. So there can be a lot of uh, you know indirect impact which can happen through some of those sanctions. Plus, as Ronak was saying, I think the easiest is non-access to the financial markets, including uh, you know basically dealing with foreign exchange, because everything that you deal with may be routed through the New York banks or New York banking system, Swift processes, and so on and so forth. And you can obviously get caught in between some of those things as part of the business. So I think you need to really evaluate your group company structure, your businesses, your dealings with foreign counterparts, the lending arrangements, and really minutely look at some of those provisions to see where it gets uh, affected, or where are the touch points from a US perspective, and anything and everything can get affected. So sometimes it can really disrupt a lot of ongoing businesses which you may not
Thank you
envisage at
so
the
much.
time.
Excellent. And I think we'll move to question answers very soon, but I have one last question for the panel, and very quickly, because we need to have about 10 minutes for question answers. What are some of the countermeasures adopted by India or Indian entities, in overcoming these U.S. sanctions? And what are your thoughts on the subject? Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll take that first. So some of the primary countermeasures, let's say in the example of India's dealing with Iran, was this agreement whereby dealings, export and import between Iran and India would be done through the rupee mechanism. And now this was done out of a bank which is called the UCO Bank. UCO Bank does not have any exposure to the US financial system. So, what happened in this scenario was that when India imported oil from Iran, certain amount of monies would be deposited into a designated account in the bank in rupees, and then when Iranian businesses exported imported goods from India, they would pay that amount out of that to the Indian companies through that account in the UCO bank. So there are certain mechanisms which have been developed where which can circumvent the ramifications of these US sanctions. However, having said that, with these increasing US sanctions, where India is required to completely stop its imports from oil imports from Iran, this would in fact make it even more difficult to have these mechanisms to circumvent these sanctions. Having said that, in the past, during the Cold War as well, India had entered into the rupee ruble agreement with Russia, whereas transactions between India and Russia were carried out through rupees and ruble. So there are certain countermeasures that many countries are trying to develop to circumvent these US sanctions. However, it all
Maybe I think
depends.
we should hear from Ronak as a last word
Yeah.
as to how that is looked at US, looked at upon by the US, and maybe then we can open up the floor for questions, because we would also like
Yeah.
to hear comments from them.
Yeah, and I'll be very, very brief. I think everything that's been said on that topic is 100% correct. And, India has been in the past effective at setting up these alternative structures. I mean, the U.S. looks at these to say, again, if there's exposure to the U.S. banking system, they will pursue enforcement action. So long as the mechanism that's being erected doesn't touch the U.S. financial system or banking system, there has not been enforcement in the past. And sort of, since 2012, effectively, India has figured out various innovative ways to still make it work. There's been these very sophisticated bartering systems where it's rupees for oil, or wheat or barley. I mean, we've seen all sorts of different things happen. The larger principle to keep in mind, though, is simply this: the U.S. is very, very, very aggressive with respect to asserting jurisdiction uh, for sanctions purposes, and they feel as if that even if there's the most minimum touch point, that there's a email that's been routed through the U.S. or that it touched a network in New York to transfer money from two banks outside the U.S. From an American perspective, that is sufficient to exercise and assert jurisdiction. And that's something that every company and country should keep in mind in this context.
Yeah, I think, thank you so much, Ron, for the intervention, very quick one. And let us move to the questions so that, audience has an opportunity to ask some questions. I would request everyone to ask a question, be very brief, so that we can respond in a pointed way and more people can participate if they want to. Thank you. The question answers open.
Thank you very much, sir. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin with the question and answer session. Anyone who wishes to ask a question may press star and one on their touchtone telephone. If you wish to remove yourself from the question queue, you may press star and two. Participants are requested to use handset while asking questions. Ladies and gentlemen, we will wait for a moment while the question queue assembles. To ask a question, please press star and one. The first question is from Amar Sundaram from RBS India. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nishith Bhai. This is Amar. I'm the General Counsel for RBS India. Wonderful session, and thank you for Vyapak Bhai. Thank you, Ronak. You have broadly covered everything, and therefore this question is purely from an academic point of view. We all understand that such sanctions does not have a force of law, and therefore the academic question is there any example where such sanctions has been held to be illegal or inappropriate by ICJ or any of the UN resolutions?
Ronak, do you have any thought on the history?
I'm trying to think of some good examples because there have been instances, and that's a great question, and it's wonderful to connect with you now. I mean, there have been instances where, again, not just India but other countries have said that the underlying sanction that has been imposed by the U.S. Has been illegal, and yet they'll still comply. Now, the ICJ has ordered the United States as recently as last year to make the sanctions less stringent. And especially we see that in the context of humanitarian exports, food, medicine, safety equipment for airplanes, for example. The ICJ has expressly said in a ruling last year that goods and services such as those should be exempt from a U.S. sanctions regime, and that for the United States to target those specifically is in contravention of governing international law. And what the U.S. has tried to do historically, and I use that word with emphasis, is exempt those types of goods and services because they're humanitarian nature. And this is, of course, a big issue, not just in Iran, but also in Venezuela, where you have a major food crisis and you have a shortage of some very important necessities. The U.S.'s response to that has varied over the last 10 years. Of course, the Trump administration has taken a much more aggressive posture vis-a-vis some of its predecessors. But the ICJ and other international multilateral fora have tried to ensure that the U.S. strikes the right balance of achieving its objectives through sanctions, but also balancing that against humanitarian needs as well.
Yeah. So I hope, Amar, that answers, and thanks for joining this, and congratulations on your new role at RBS. We should catch up in some time. Yeah.
Thank you. Other question?
Thank you. Next question is from the line of Krishan Mehta from SteadView. Please go ahead.
Yes. My question relates to the special purpose vehicles set up by the European countries that are in compliance with the Iranian agreement. To what extent does that vehicle and the banking relationships there provide an outlet for Indian companies to continue to trade with Iran and Russia in a way, particularly Iran, in a way that is not in violation of the U.S. sanctions?
Yeah, hi. So I think the special purpose vehicles that you must be referring to is where entities have developed a mechanism to trade in euros, right? Is that the SPV that you're referring to?
Yes, that's correct.
So, like I mentioned earlier, it all depends on how much you rely on the US financial system and the US mechanism. If your business is such that you can completely carry out trade in euros without having to even send an email to a US entity somewhere, or without requiring any equipment from some US entity to be a component in whatever you're manufacturing, then theoretically you can go ahead and have the SPVs. But having said that, and Ronak can add here, you have to be very careful, because in today's globalized world, it will be very difficult to find a situation where even such an SPV where you're dealing with in just euros can be completely
Devoid of
shielded
connection, without any connection with
with
US.
the US. So it all depends on the circumstances.
Yeah, this is Ronak. That's exactly right. And ultimately, the SPV, again, from a U.S. perspective, the government here is looking very closely at jurisdictional issues. It's looking at nexus. It's looking at whether or not the transaction is being conducted exclusively in euros, if there is any touch point with the U.S. system. And under the Trump administration, and this is, I've had off-the-record conversations with officials here, they see the SPV as a mechanism to evade U.S. sanctions. Now, that's not the official policy of the government, but, there is a feeling that the SPV was set up by the Europeans to allow countries in Asia and South America and Africa and the Middle East to evade sanctions, American sanctions and contravention of the larger U.S. Enforcement regime in that area. So the spirit of what the SPV is trying to accomplish, again, I very much so, it's about legitimate trade. How U.S. enforcement authorities and regulators will look at that, again, will be very much case by case, and the facts surrounding the engagement with the SPV becomes dispositive at that point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before we take the next question, we would like to remind participants that you may enter star and one to ask a question. The next question is from Manjinder Singh from Mahindra & Mahindra. Please go ahead.
Yeah, my question is in line with Ronak's advice, assuming that I analyze my operations in terms of the exposure to Iran, take all the mitigated measures, but am I still or do I get any immunity from sanctions by virtue of the reason of actions of my players in the value chain, say my supplier or my customers down the line are dealing with specific sanction areas, as in they are violating those sanctions, or for that matter, even if my competitor is taking such an action. So, am I getting any immunity by virtue of having a robust compliance regime within my organization?
Right. And again, the best that I can offer you in response to that question is what we've seen in the past in terms of what Treasury and Commerce and the other relevant agencies with enforcement authority have done. In those instances where there has been efforts of robust compliance or the existence of a robust compliance program, those are remedial actions. Does that provide immunity? I mean, the short answer is no. And again, this is just based on what I've seen in the past. This isn't me offering express legal guidance. But what we've seen, looking at the hundreds of instances where Treasury and OFAC, Office of Foreign Asset Control, and others have engaged in enforcement, is those companies that have had robust compliance programs are just by logic going to be better situated to deal with the enforcement authority than those that don't. Because if there's an instance where there is a genuine, true compliance program and the company has made sincere effort to comply and sincere effort to take prophylactic measures, and what I mean by that is to take measures that are preventative, not just reactive, we've seen that those companies tend to, relatively speaking, do better. Immunity, there's no statutory guidance with respect to that says if you do 1, 2, and 3, it's going to allow you to be immunized, even if it's your subsidiary or a subsidiary doing something like that. So that's something where, again, I would highly recommend, again, it's a very fact-specific inquiry, and to engage U.S. counsel to ensure that, the right systems and internal controls are in place in case there is a potential issue on the horizon.
Yes, got it.
Thank you. Participants who wish to ask a question may enter star and 1 at this time.
Since there are no more questions,
Yes, sir, there are no questions in queue.
I think this has been really wonderful interaction, and I hope it has been useful. And Vyapak, you may want to have a few words of conclusion. And
Yeah, only words of conclusions I think is thanking all the participants to join on this day, particularly from Mumbai at least, and from elsewhere in the world. And I think thanks a lot for Ronak to join at such an early hour from US and giving his insights and expertise, which clearly gives enough guidance, if I may say so, to ensure that you are not on the wrong side of the law when some of these implications come, which can significantly impact the business. So thank you all for joining this, and we hope to continue to do series of these topics, considering the kind of activities and uh, interest that people have, and including the kind of seriousness US is putting on some of these measures. So we'll be back, uh, sometime soon, and we'll notify the people here, and we'll have another round of interaction on this. So thanks again, and thank you all.
And this is Ronak, and I just want to say thank you for having me. And again, look, from the U.S. side, let me just say one quick thing. As a U.S. practitioner that's been dealing with this for a very long time, I understand that it can be frustrating. I understand that there's just uncertainty that's been injected into this landscape, for the past several years, but especially since the new transition in government here in the U.S. And it's something that we on the U.S. side recognize and sympathize with. And it's the reason why it's so important to have appropriate counsel, both in India and here in the U.S. So I'm always a resource and at anyone's disposal that needs to, discuss these issues further. And I know, again, Nishith Desai and the entire firm is such a repository of knowledge and of guidance in this regard as well. So again, understanding the realities of the situation, it's just, such a pleasure to be able to do this with all of you and look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Ronak. So wonderful to have you with us, and Vyapak and Siddharth. Really thank you for bringing all the practical insights into the whole subject. I hope it has been useful. And sayonara. I think we'll meet on another webinar very soon. Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.